Chapter 15. The Siege of Hiroshima. I don't remember the hours after the Soviet raid very well. According to Soylent, Holly, Hal, Tsubaki, and Aaron, I was in some kind of blind blood rage and couldn't be reasoned with. All I wanted was to vent and rage and fight and kill. After everything I'd gone through to get her back, the Soviets had just snatched her away with seemingly the smallest effort. My mood didn't improve when I found out what happened to Yutaka and Yukiko. Best I can tell, they were talking to the enemy for months, possibly as long as a year, Soylent told us. They had your antenna, Robinson. Every moment it wasn't with you, those buggers had it. Even Tsubaki knew to back away from me as I looked for something to hit or throw. In the end, I picked up a fallen assault rifle and smashed it against the exterior wall of what had once been the school. And let me guess, the Russians took them too? I yelled to no one in particular. Seems that way, Hal said. I saw Yukiko drop a red smoke grenade on her own position, and then some Spetsnaz walked right up to her and Yutaka. No gunfire, just words. Then they were gone. I picked up my assault rifle and started walking in the direction the enemy helo had flown away. And just where are you going? Holly called after me. Where do you think? I snapped. I'm going to get her back. You don't even know where she is, you moron, Hal shot back. She could be anywhere in Japan, if she's not halfway to Siberia right now. I wanted to slug Hal in the face, but he was right. Aaron grabbed my shoulder. Let's get on the radio and call for help, he said. We've got a U.S. Army Ranger unit not far from here. They'll know what to do. That takes time, I said angrily. You heard McIntosh. The longer we wait, the further away she might be getting. And if you charge straight into Soviet territory with no idea where to go, you'll get blown to hell, Aaron scolded me. Use your head, Robinson. Finally, I relented. Fine. Let's go to the Rangers. Red Army Forward Operating Base, Miyoshi. What's your name? Tatsuya Chiho. Now, little girl, it doesn't do any good to lie. You will only hurt yourself in the long run. Now once more, who are you? Tatsuya Chiho, apprentice seaman of the JMSDF, mechanics mate on the Hyuga. Now you're lying through your teeth, girl. I don't like girls who lie. They make me unpleasant to be around. You wouldn't want that, would you? So, tell me, who are you? Tatsuya, the nameless girl muttered. Tatsuya. I'm just Tatsuya. The Soviet intelligence officer slowly rose from his seat. The girl wanted to back away, put some distance between herself and him, but it was no good. Her ankles were shackled and her hands were cuffed behind her. She was in a cold, dark room somewhere inside of a Soviet fob. The helicopter landed in the middle of the night, so she didn't know anything else about this place. The enemy officer in front of her seemed to be considering his options. You don't know how much easier this would be if you turned out to be the person we are looking for, he said. The People's Republic doesn't want to harm you, only to free you from the enslavement of the imperialist grip of the Western powers. He put both hands on the table and leaned in close. So close, in fact, that he could have kissed the 16-year-old prisoner. She tried to recoil, but he couldn't get far. The People's Republic has heard much about the Princess Asami of Chiako, how she wanted to protect and save the innocent and defenseless people of Japan, how she survived the attack on the Hyuga and swam to Okinawa as though she were some kind of blue water dragon, how she saved the lives of youngsters who didn't belong on the battlefield at all. Princess Chiako is the kind of hero the People's Republic has been waiting for. And we have prepared a wonderful new life for her, if only she would cooperate with her new political handler. The man withdrew. leaving the nameless girl with a sense of existential terror crawling all over her flesh. Then he moved to the door, opened it a crack, and spoke to someone just outside. "Who's in the next room?" "Pavlov," said a man. "He's with the long-haired girl." "Tell him to start working on her," replied the intelligence officer, "and make it noisy." Then the intelligence officer shut the door, and he came back to the table. He sat down, folded his hands, and stared at the nameless girl, his eyes boring into hers. A moment later, a noise came through the wall behind the girl that would give her nightmares for years to come. A high-pitched scream echoed through the corrugated metal wall, making the nameless girl jump in fright. She had no idea what was going on in the next room, but for all the nameless girl could tell, it sounded like Chihiro Iwasaki was being beaten to within an inch of her life. The officer said nothing. He continued to stare at the nameless girl, who was forced to listen to the seemingly unending torture of her comrade. The nameless ex-royal closed her eyes and tried to ignore or tune out the wails and screams coming from next door, but the accompanying sounds of violence punctuated each audible drama. At one point, she could swear she heard Chihiro Iwasaki shriek, "Please stop! I'll say whatever you want! I'll talk! Please, I'll talk!" But no questions were asked, no demands made. Instead, the assault continued. The unnamed girl opened her eyes the smallest fraction and whimpered, "Make it stop, please." "Only the Princess Asami can do that." The intelligence officer's voice was just barely audible over the noise of Chiho's screams. "If you are not the princess we're looking for, then you're just any other Jap, and you'll get the same reception as any other Jap." The Soviet officer stood and walked around the table. He grabbed the nameless girl by the neck and pushed her head down onto the table. She screamed as she felt the man position himself behind her in a way that had some very dark implications. He grabbed one of the girl's braided pigtails and pulled. "Who are you?" he roared. "What is your name?" "Tatsuya!" she cried in pain and fear. The officer grabbed the girl by her hair and pulled her into a standing position. "If you really are not the princess, then you don't have what I want." The officer's voice sounded even more dangerous now. "But you still have something the rest of my men want, and I'm sure they'll tire of the girl in the other room soon enough. If you are not Asami, then you're next. But my intel says I should give you a chance to come clean before I throw you into the barracks with 100 men who haven't seen or touched a woman in months." He fell silent, forcing the nameless girl to listen to the ongoing assault in the next room. Chihiro Iwasaki was crying and screaming wordlessly. The sound of her agony was traumatizing. "What do you want?" Her voice was very weak now. "Answer the question truthfully," the intelligence officer growled. "Are you or are you not the Princess Asami of Chiyako?" The girl hung her head. Then, in the slowest, most defeated of movements, she nodded. The intelligence officer's breath caught for just a moment. Then he wrapped one of his arms around the girl's chest and held her even tighter, like a lover's embrace. The nameless girl struggled and writhed against him. "Good," he said. "You will be sent to your new home in the People's Republic soon enough. But first, a reminder. You need to know what happens when you cross your political handlers again." And then the nameless girl felt the officer push her back down onto the table. "No, wait!" The officer grabbed her right-hand pigtail and used a bayonet to cut it off so forcefully that he drew blood from her scalp. The nameless girl screamed louder than ever, overwhelmed by the pain of nearly being scalped. Then the officer finally released her. "That is a warning," he said, "and this is a trophy." Then the officer put the girl's severed pigtail in his pocket and walked over to the cell door. He opened it and spoke to the soldiers standing outside. We confirmed her identity. Tell Pavlov to wrap up, and then... What the hell was that? A loud noise came from somewhere outside. Gunfire, shouting, a loud crash. The intelligence officer ran across the room and put both hands on the girl's head, forcing her to kneel down behind the table. "Stay low," he ordered. "Sir," a voice shouted in the hallway, "a Jap is escaping. She's killed 2 of our men." "Shoot her, then," the officer snapped. "Kill her on the spot." Many men have tried to kill Akira Robinson. Women, too, and for a wide variety of reasons. No one ever succeeded. Many had their own lives taken in return, and this is exactly what happened to the squad of Soviet soldiers dispatched to stop Nanako Yamada's escape attempt. There were many survivors and witnesses, but their testimony about what happened was deemed to be outlandish by the Russian government, and all records of Nanako's escape were destroyed. The soldiers who survived her onslaught were discredited by their government, and a few were even disavowed outright. The result of this cover-up is that my family and I could only track down and interview a single witness. Corporal Honda, a Japanese soldier, was captured by the Soviets during the raid on the 13th Artillery Company. He was being made to wait outside the entrance to a hastily built prisoner of war camp for processing, when he picked up on the sounds of gunfire coming from inside the POW camp. Instinctively, Honda hit the ground, lying low and keeping his hands over his head. He hoped at first that a friendly force was attacking the camp to liberate the prisoners. But this isn't what happened. Looking up, Honda saw something incredible. This was his description. About 20 Red Army soldiers were standing together in a group. They were all firing their weapons towards a girl who was walking down the lane between 2 shipping containers. In that cramped space, this girl, maybe 16 or 17 years old, walked straight through the storm of bullets as though it was nothing more than a light breeze. She raised one hand and slashed it through the air as though swatting a fly. The 2 closest soldiers were thrown high into the air as though they'd stepped on one of those comically stupid trampolines from a kid's anime. The 2 men flew about 100 feet into the sky and crashed back down, splattering blood all over the place as they hit the ground. Meanwhile, other soldiers were being shot. Bullets seemed to be flying out of nowhere and hitting the Russian guards. Honda admitted he had no idea who was shooting them, nor did he know exactly what direction the bullets were coming from. But we know. My family immediately recognized his description of the psionic technique Reflect, which allows a well-trained user to absorb energy from an attack and return it to the attacker with a vengeance. Akira was shooting the enemy with their own bullets. Honda watched as Akira plowed her way through nearly 24 armed men. Most of them were slain through her own sheer willpower, while a select few were driven insane by her gaze, throwing their weapons down and running into the darkness, screaming incoherently. The last thing Honda remembered before she vanished was a loud roar, accompanied by one of the Soviet soldiers suddenly bursting into flames. "But this isn't the kind of fire you and I were used to," Corporal Honda told us. "It was as blue as the twilight sky. Almost a violet shade, really." After the telekinetic murder of 20 men, the crushing of 3 men's minds, and the soul-fire immolation of one last victim, Akira fled the camp and started racing towards Hiroshima on foot. Meanwhile, the nameless girl was thrown unceremoniously into a holding cell. With no windows or lights, she was in complete darkness, with her hands and feet bound. There was nothing she could do but wait for her doom. After the fact, we now know that roughly 9 hours passed, and that outside the sun was starting to rise while Soviet search parties combed the surrounding area for Nanako, who was long gone by this time. While the girl waited in the dark silence, Soviet officers contacted their superiors to spread the word that Princess Asami had been captured. Leaders of the so-called People's Republic demanded her immediate extradition to Hokkaido. As long as she renounced the Japanese cause and publicly supported the Soviet Union and her allies, her new home would be a luxurious palace in Sapporo. Some government records in Moscow suggested there was a plan to make Princess Asami into the new head of state of the so-called People's Republic. A puppet in reality. Of course, we'll never know what would have happened if the ex-princess's extradition went smoothly, because it did not go smoothly. In fact, it didn't happen at all. November 10th, 2012. A dull noise caught the nameless girl's attention. Somebody was being thrown into the holding cell right next to her. She held perfectly still, hoping that nobody went into hers. Very soon there was silence again. Just when the former royal was starting to relax, there was a scuffing noise. It came from a crack where one wall met the floor of her cell. It wasn't a perfect seal, and the girl could feel air flowing from between the two cells. "Hello?" said a voice. The nameless girl's heart leapt. It was Kotori Sato. "Sato-chan!" the girl cried softly in Japanese. "It's so good to hear your voice." "Tatsuya-san, you're alive!" Kotori hissed. "Oh, that's wonderful. Hey, they got you tied up?" "Yeah, I can't move." Kotori swore. The nameless girl couldn't help but notice that Kotori's voice was very strained, as though she was in a great deal of pain and trying to hide it. "Listen, Tatsuya-san, I know what happened outside last night," Kotori went on. "What was it?" "Yama-chan." Kotori called Nanako, Akira, by a nickname. "She fought her way out and escaped. She's loose." The nameless girl wept for joy. At least someone had gotten free of this nightmare. "Wait, how do you know about all that?" she asked. "The bastards thought I helped her escape," Kotori said. "Fuckers just pulled me into a room and interrogated me for God knows how long." Suddenly, the strained noise in Kotori's voice made more sense. A horrible sinking feeling started to fill the nameless girl's stomach as Inamura's words and fears drifted through the forefront of her mind. "Kotori," she said slowly, "are you okay? They didn't... Did they?" Pause. The silent confirmation made the nameless girl's blood run cold. "Yeah, they did." Kotori seethed from the other side of the wall. 6 of them, all at once. After a while, they stopped asking how I helped Nanako get away. Bastards were just having fun. After a few moments, there was a horrified silence. The nameless girl was still in a pitch-dark cell, but for some reason, she could see Inamura's face in front of her, as though the young woman was actually there. On the other side of the wall, Kotori could be heard taking a deep breath. The former princess started to cry, causing Kotori to say, "Hey over there, save the crying for later. I'm gonna need your help in a few minutes." "Uh-huh?" the girl sobbed. "What do you mean?" "I'm pulling a Yamada." Kotori's voice was strained again. It sounded like she was pulling on something. "I'm getting out of here." Then there was an audible snap in the next room. Wriggling against her bonds, the nameless girl rolled herself over to the wall, the better to speak with Kotori. "What?" she gasped. "How?" "I don't know," Kotori admitted. "I'm just kind of making this up as I go. And I'd rather get shot and die than go through that again. Stand back, Tatsuya." "Lying on my side," the nameless girl said. "I'm tied up, remember?" "Well, I'm not tied up anymore," Kotori replied over the sound of a second loud snap. As the nameless girl rolled away from the wall, there was a soft noise. Kotori was running her hands along the wall. "Figures," Kotori mumbled. "The Russians built this place quickly. All of these buildings are made from shipping containers. Thin metal. Hold on, Tatsuya. This is going to be loud." And then, bang! Kotori rammed her whole body into the wall as fast and as hard as she could. Just as she hoped, the thin, pliable metal gave way at once. The collapsing metal narrowly missed the nameless girl, and Kotori was in the cell with her. A moment later, Kotori was at her side, breaking the zip ties around her ankles. "Gotcha," Kotori said. "Now stand up, quick. I can hear them coming." Kotori's hands fiddled with the nameless girl's wrists in the darkness, while Russian voices filtered through the cell door, growing louder and more alarmed with each moment. "I just need a few more seconds," Kotori gasped. "These zip ties are really tight." The footsteps suddenly stopped. Russian soldiers shouted to one another in a panic, while the loud pops and snaps of gunfire sounded from outside. Panic rising in her body and mind, the nameless girl asked, "What's going on now?" The same moment, 2,000 yards away. "There!" Nanako Yamada shouted as the Humvee crested the hill. "That's it! That's the Russian base!" She clambered up into the gunner's turret and pointed towards the enemy fob. From my place in the passenger seat, I could see a Soviet helicopter, the transport kind, hovering about 300 feet above the base, as though it was coming in for a landing. "Captain Smith!" I shouted into the radio. "Enemy helo!" "We see it," Holly's voice replied, "getting ready to engage." A second later, a second vehicle came onto the hilltop. It was an American tank. Specifically, it was an M3 Bradley fighting vehicle. The turret swiveled around to face the Soviet helicopter, and then the 25mm chain gun came to life. With a vicious pom, 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 the enemy helicopter was rent into pieces. Fire and metal rained down on the enemy like a scene from a war movie. Enemy soldiers ran away from the crash, only to be caught by surprise when 2 American war vehicles rolled into their midst. The Humvee and Bradley smashed through the entrance and came to rest in the heart of the Soviet fob, their position marked by smoke from the downed helicopter. "Joyride's over," shouted the Humvee driver. "Everyone out." Both doors of the Bradley and Humvee opened, and nearly 24 soldiers, a mixed force of American, British, Australian, and Japanese fighters, erupted into the middle of the enemy camp. Soviet soldiers, caught by surprise, had little time to react. In fact, only the highly trained Spetsnaz fighters seemed to be ready for us. When Holly dismounted from the Bradley, an RPG sailed over her head and just narrowly missed the cannon turret. "Light those bastards up!" Holly screamed to her troops. "I want fire superiority now!" Soylent, Hal, and Tsubaki joined our allies in the assault. Meanwhile, Aaron, Nanako, and I split from the group. The 3 of us were going to rescue the prisoners. I was on the rescue team because Holly guessed, rightly so, that I would commit fratricide if given a different role in the mission. Aaron was here to keep me in check, and Nanako, still Akira in disguise, was leading the way since she knew where everything was. All 3 of us were carrying dozens of submachine guns and pistols strapped to our body armor. Together, the 3 of us were leaving a swath of dead or wounded Russians in our wake. As we burst into the makeshift POW camp, Aaron and I started yelling at the top of our lungs. "Americans! Can you hear us? Brits and Aussies and Japs! Who's up for round 2? Allied prisoners made themselves known, kicking and banging at the doors of their holding cells. While Aaron and Nanako kept the guards occupied, I used a pump-action shotgun to force the first doors open. A handful of Australian soldiers with the word Bushranger written on their shirts came out to meet us and took the guns I offered them. "If you're true blue, follow me!" an Aussie shouted before leading his men into the fight. Aaron, meanwhile, found the American prisoners a few hundred yards away. "Guns for everyone!" he shouted. "We might as well be in Texas!" I knew why he said that. He was trying to find our friends from the 13th, and hopefully Kate Newberry would be among them. The British and Japanese soldiers were being held in the same area, but I never got to see it because they came out to meet us. Soviet soldiers, disarmed and panicking, fled before an onslaught of men and women, many of whom seemed ready to inflict genuine horrors upon their captors. A furious melee broke out in the center of the POW camp as the Russians were finally overwhelmed. Russian men were brought down by a mob of escaped prisoners. Aaron, Nanako, and I were pretty much stripped of all the extra weapons we brought with us to assist in the jailbreak. I feel no need to say what they were used for. In the middle of this sea of violence, 2 people ran forward and slammed into me like missiles. The sudden double bear hug almost knocked me off my feet. "Blake!" the nameless girl screamed. "Robinson! Ray! Yamada!" Kotori seemed struck dumb with shock. "What the hell are you three doing here?" "We were coming to rescue you," I shot back. The nameless girl and Kotori both looked terrible, but Kotori had clearly gotten the worst of it. The woman who would one day give birth to humanity's savior was badly battered and had bruises on her wrists, arm, neck, and face. Kotori was also sporting a black eye. Some of her hair had been cut off, and her military uniform was reduced to bloody rags. Someone had slashed it with a knife. The nameless girl, by comparison, was only a little rough around the edges. One of her pigtails was cut off, giving her head a lopsided look. Otherwise, she'd been spared whatever Kotori went through. She looked around at the chaotic scene, admiring our handiwork. "Well, this is some rescue," she declared. "Did you find the others, Iwasaki and Newberry?" "Still working on that," Aaron answered. "I promise we're not leaving until we've accounted for everyone." Yeah, Kotori added. "Leave no one behind. Good idea." Our newly reunited group took off at a run, Kotori lagging behind a little, both because she was seriously injured and because she was looking at Aaron as though she'd seen him in a whole new light. Nanako pointed towards a shipping container that had been converted into a building. "In there," she said. "That's where they were interrogating us." The door was ajar. "Ray!" I yelled. "Roll a bang under the door! Yamada, breach and clear!" Aaron sent a flashbang grenade skittering into the makeshift building. As soon as we heard the loud crack of the detonation, Nanako kicked the door open and went in first. In the single moment she was out of our sight, we heard 3 gunshots before Yamada called back to us, "Clear!" We all stormed into the room, and what we found was god-awful. Out of respect for our friends, I will only share sparse details of their deaths. You only need to know that Kate Newberry and Chihiro Iwasaki were both murdered before we had a chance to find them. And their demise was not quick. Our friends suffered for several hours, and I'm sure that death itself must have been sweet and wonderful in comparison to the agony that preceded it. Aaron retched. My girlfriend vomited. Kotori had a panic attack. I guess I had a panic attack too. The sounds of gunfire seemed to just stop. The whole world felt like it stopped spinning. Nothing made sense anymore. Then Aaron managed to pull himself together. "We can't leave them here." No one argued. There was no argument to make. The other options were unacceptable. We would not allow our friends to be desecrated even further. Moving like zombies, we found Kate and Chihiro's clothes. Kotori and Nanako struggled to dress the bodies. Rigor mortis was starting to set in. Meanwhile, Aaron and I reloaded our weapons and prepared to escort our friends back towards the convoy. I pulled out my radio and called Holly. "Captain Smith, this is Private Robinson. We found our VIPs and are coming back your way." "Good to hear, Robinson," Holly replied. "I called Hiroshima. They're sending some rescue helos to airlift all the POWs out of here. Tell me everyone's status and I'll pass it along to the medics." For a moment, I couldn't talk. It was like my whole body was refusing to deliver such news. 2 alive, but they need medical attention. Also, Iwasaki and Newberry are KIA. The radio seemed to be dead for almost a whole minute. Behind us, Nanako just barely managed to heave Chihiro's semi-stiff body over her shoulder. "Oh, sweet Jesus in heaven," Holly breathed. "Okay, I'll tell the medics." By the time Aaron, Kotori, Nanako, my girlfriend and I reached the rest of our squad, the battle was pretty much over. Any soldier who could hold a rifle was guarding the perimeter, watching for Soviet counterattack. Half a dozen American helicopters were overhead. 4 of them were heavily armed with weapons, while the other 2 were painted with the Red Cross insignia and had the word "Rescue" written underneath. Soylent Green dropped his weapon at the sight of Kate's body in Aaron's arms. "No! What happened?" None of us had any words. It took several days for us to finally part ways with the bodies of our friends. It was a little sentimental. Some of us just didn't want to say goodbye. There was also the logistical issue. Hiroshima was still surrounded, and Hokkaido was still occupied. We literally couldn't send our friends to be buried at their homes. Instead, all of the fallen soldiers of the 13th Artillery were laid to rest on the grounds of a temple just outside of downtown Hiroshima. In America, we bury our dead. Japan's small size and rather cramped cities mean that large cemeteries are unfeasible. Instead, nearly everyone who dies in Japan is cremated. Then the remains are buried in a family plot. As the siege went on, the prefectural government set aside a whole cemetery for soldiers killed in battle. Kate Newberry, Chihiro Iwasaki, Mateo Hernandez, and Asuna Tachibana were cremated early in the morning on the 15th of November, and we buried them towards the end of the day. Kotori and the nameless girl were hit really hard by all of this. Kotori tried to be stone-faced and hide her emotions, but all it took was Aaron making an offer to let Kotori cry on his shoulder, and she broke down. Racked with survivor's guilt, my girlfriend spent every waking hour sitting beside our friends' graves. Sometimes she wouldn't eat, and at least once, she stayed awake for 2 days. In the meantime, the enemy continued closing the noose around Hiroshima. A near-continuous naval battle was raging in the Seto Inland Sea as Allied forces tried to dislodge the Soviet fleet. Each day we heard reports about another enemy ship sunk or a plane downed, so progress was being made. The problem was the attack coming from land. The JSDF's failed assault on the town of Obama created a gaping hole in Japan's defense, and the country was now quite literally split in half. Soviet soldiers and vehicles were pouring through the Obama-Tottori corridor, bypassing Osaka entirely to reach us. The vast majority of Allied forces were concentrated around Tokyo, leaving only a token force to defend Hiroshima. And that token force was in complete disarray. I mentioned in the previous chapter that we were caught in an artillery bombardment. The Soviets fired nearly 30,000 rockets at Hiroshima, inflicting great damage on not just us, but the whole city and all of its defenders as well. Several bridges were damaged, restricting mobility around the city, which, I should remind you, is built on a river delta. The Ota River and its countless branches suddenly became a massive and troublesome obstacle for us. But then there was the real problem, the one that threatened to end the war immediately and not in our favor. Nearly all of the high-ranking military officers on our side were dead. Nobukazu Igarashi, the man who started my family on this project, was able to explain how and why this happened. On the morning of December 9th, Japanese Prime Minister Ryo Nakagawa gathered his cabinet to discuss strategy options. He wanted to investigate the possibility of a counterattack to break the siege. The conversation got heated as ideas were thrown around. Finally, someone, we don't know who, raised the idea of calling all battalion and division-level commanders to an emergency meeting in downtown Hiroshima to figure out a plan to break the siege. Enemy rockets started raining down while all of the officers and commanders on our side were on the move. Some were flattened in their vehicles. Others were crushed when buildings came down on top of them. A few fell into the Ota River when the bridges collapsed, and the rest were trapped in debris and wreckage, expiring before help could arrive. Generals, colonels, marshals, and commanders, all dead. By pure good luck, 2 military leaders survived. American General Laura Harper and UN General Peter Van Dorn both made it out. Much later on, we learned why. Laura Harper and Nakagawa did not see eye to eye, and throughout the war they regularly argued and fought over strategy. During the final year of the war, Harper and Nakagawa fell out so badly that they spent the weeks leading up to the siege of Hiroshima trading insults over the radio. Their latest disagreement ended so badly that when Nakagawa put out a call for a meeting, Harper simply refused to attend. As a result, she never left her bunker, leaving her safe from the bombardment. General Van Dorn was nothing short of a wild card and spent most of the war out of control. The night before the bombardment, Van Dorn took a strike force of U.S. Rangers into the mountains of Seki Ward. When the rockets started raining down, Van Dorn and his men were about 30 miles away, trying to pick a fight with the Spetsnaz. You can imagine their surprise when they returned to the city and found it cratered like the surface of the moon. By the end of November, what remained of the 13th Artillery had fallen into a siege routine. We tried to sleep for 5 to 6 hours a night, being woken up periodically by Russian artillery or mortar strikes, plus the occasional bombing run. Then we'd spend most of the day working in shifts. For about 6 hours a day, each of us worked on a gun crew, firing one of our 10 remaining howitzers at the approaching Russians. The rest of the day we took our weapons and armor and went out on combat patrol. We would scour the outskirts of Hiroshima and push back enemy recon elements. They were looking for a way in. By this point, the enemy was so close that we couldn't go into the forests or mountains anymore. Approximately 1 million civilians and some 25,000 soldiers were trapped inside of the city proper. People couldn't evacuate because the harbor was blockaded. Escape by air wasn't an option either. Hiroshima International Airport was surrounded by enemy anti-air elements, ranging from static missile launchers to mobile Biryusas and men carrying shoulder-mounted Stinger launchers. To make matters worse, enemy mortars had cratered all of the runways, meaning that supplies from Korea and Free Japan had to be dropped into the city via parachute. Our best hope was to hold out until the Russians broke, and we all knew it. The naval blockade was getting weaker every day thanks to constant pressure from the Americans. If the situation stayed constant, we would have been fine. But war isn't like that. The enemy was gathering strength for the knockout blow. Yutaka Yamamoto and Yukiko Takahashi were now fully integrated into the enemy force. Yutaka was commissioned into the Red Army as an officer and given command of a recon unit. Yukiko was his subordinate. Decades later, during the Second Hyperspace War, my wife and I did ask Yukiko Takahashi a few questions about their experience on the other side of the war. "It was very surreal," Yukiko told us. "The Soviet propaganda machine was going full speed, and their political officers told us that we were about to win the war at any moment. But all of the actual soldiers knew better. The average Red Army soldier at Hiroshima was starving, wore ratty old clothes, and was so low on ammo that he was restricted to just 40 bullets per day. Near the end, most Russian troops were only given 10 bullets each day." Yukiko and Yamamoto lived in Russia after the war, so they were able to give us a reasonably accurate picture of the Soviet Union itself during these final months. "The writing was on the wall," Yukiko elaborated. "The Europeans had their boots on Western Russia's throat. Rebels were popping up like weeds all over the place, and things were breaking down everywhere. Riots in the streets, the markets were looted, and there were gunfights outside of government buildings. It was all falling apart. President Kimoto bungled the war, and everyone knew it. And in those last few months, more and more people in Russia stopped predicting the collapse of society. Instead, they said it had already fallen." According to Yukiko, the Soviet Union was collapsing from within for at least a few months before the siege of Hiroshima got underway. The siege itself and the final battle were simply the straw that broke the pack animal's back. "We were running out of supplies on the ground," Yukiko said at the end of her post-war statement. "And then you Americans cut the supply line itself." To be specific, my dad was the one who cut the enemy supply line. In 2012, the war was going on 6 years old. People were getting really sick and tired of the fighting. In America, just like Russia, people just wanted it to end at any cost. The political situation was going south in the US as well. My dad knew that if he ran for a third term, he'd be destroyed by even the weakest challenger. So he withdrew from the presidential election altogether, setting himself up to leave the presidency in January of 2013. The power vacuum he was threatening to leave was a serious issue, and some heavy hitters showed up for the contest. The 2012 U.S. presidential election happened on November 6th. Vice President Alexis Alexander had become a political powerhouse by then, and she decided to press her luck all the way. With my dad stepping down, she seized control of his political movement and became its new leader. It was another three-way race. Senator John McCain took the lead for the Republicans, while Senator Barack Obama was the Democratic nominee. In true American fashion, the election was a nail-biter, and nobody knew who won until the sun rose the following morning. Alexander just barely eked out a win, with a margin of victory even smaller than my dad's re-election, and would be the next president of the United States. But here's the thing with America. Even though Alexander was elected president, my dad got to do the job for 3 more months. Not days. Not weeks. 3 Earth months. Luna orbited our Jericho-forsaken planet 3 times before America swapped in a new president in the middle of a major war. Here, in the modern day, changing a head of government is a fast and streamlined affair. Let's say, hypothetically, that 2 years from now, I defeat Pascal Etienne and win the Secretary General's office. In such a case, I would assume the office of Secretary General just 3 weeks later. 21 days. Earth doesn't take risks with what were once called lame duck sessions, and my dad is a huge reason why this is true. During the last 3 months of his presidency, when the American people had already picked his successor, my dad took one of his most controversial actions. More diverse than forcing Puerto Rico into the Union via executive order, more consequential than the long-term declassifying of a bunch of secret XCOM files from the 1960s. My dad dropped the bomb 8 times. November 30th, 2012. 90 miles east of Busan, Sea of Japan. The knockout blow was ready. Under the command of the flagship Kuznetsov, a huge armada of Soviet warships began making a run for the Tsushima Strait, the gap between Japan and Korea. They were going to reinforce and resupply the attackers of Hiroshima, putting an end to this war once and for all. There was only one obstacle left: a mixed force of Japanese, Korean, and American warships lurking in the waters of Tsushima. A furious naval battle erupted. The Allied command ship, the U.S. aircraft carrier Nimitz, led a final desperate counterattack and gave the Soviets something to have nightmares about. Destruction rained from the sky as fighter jets and missiles descended upon the Soviet armada. The Tsushima Strait was soon so badly choked with crippled and sinking ships that the smoke could be seen from space. Then, the Nimitz exploded. All these decades later, we're still not sure what caused it. But my wife, for her own reasons, is deeply convinced that the Nimitz was torpedoed by a Soviet sub. Either way, one of the largest and most powerful naval vessels on Earth was suddenly and violently reduced to scrap metal. No piece bigger than a human survived. My dad was following the battle in real time from the White House Situation Room. President-elect Alexander was there because, at this point, she was still the vice president. From what I heard afterward, it was one of the most intense arguments ever. President Alexander tried to issue orders to our forces in the region, but my dad, who was still president for another 2 months, overrode her. Then he pulled out the nuclear football. Alexis Alexander had to be dragged out of the room by Secret Service agents, kicking and screaming as my dad opened the case. On the bridge of the American nuclear attack submarine Michigan, the floating wire antenna received a signal, and a red light buzzed on the bridge. The cadre of officers fell silent. They knew that red light meant only bad things. A small dot matrix printer came to life and quickly spat out the message for the captain and his crew to read. Seeing the words on the page, the captain quickly reached into his pocket and grabbed for a plastic card. He snapped it in half, revealing a smaller card within. Decryption codes. The submarine captain held his card key up to the printed message, comparing the two. "This is valid," he declared. "It's a valid launch order. Make our depth 100 feet and open vertical launch tube 15. The Michigan rose up from the depths like a genuine sea monster, pausing when she was about 10 stories beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean. Then one of her launch tubes swung open and a missile erupted from her belly. The Trident missile sailed high into the atmosphere. Even though it flew directly over Japan, none of us on the ground saw it. It was too high. Somewhere in the upper atmosphere, the missile deployed its payload. 8 cone-shaped objects fell away from their casing and descended towards the Earth. These cones were Whiskey 88 nuclear warheads, each one packed with almost 500 kilotons of firepower. 80 miles northeast of Tsushima Strait, Sea of Japan. The Allied fleets turned and fled, heading back towards Korea and Japan. What were the Soviet commanders thinking when they saw this? America's flagship was a smoldering wreck. Korean and Japanese ships were disengaging. Allied fighter jets were breaking contact and escaping. I guess they would have thought the war was over. They probably thought they won. There was nothing left between the Russian fleet and Hiroshima. All they had to do was sail through Tsushima and enter the Seto Sea. The Russian armada regrouped and began to sail for Tsushima once more, full of confidence and drunk with victory. They never would have seen the 8 streaks of white light careening across the night sky like shooting stars. The last thing any of those Soviet sailors saw would be a brilliant flash. December 1st, 2012. Central Park, Minami Ward. None of us said anything all morning. What could we say? Soldiers on both sides were in shock. The city itself came to a standstill. Well, all of Hiroshima except for one place. Sitting on the banks of the Ota River in Central Park, my girlfriend and I could hear a deep, tolling sound from the bell of peace. Looking south, we could see tens of thousands of Japanese people crossing the Aioi Bridge. They were going to pray at the atomic bomb memorial. Buddhist monks and Shinto priests, dressed in ceremonial robes, spoke briefly to the people as they entered the Peace Park. Just barely visible from our position, over the tops of several other buildings, we could just barely make out the atomic dome, a concrete building that partially survived the very first nuclear attack in human history. She swore. "The Russians are gonna burn this city to the ground," she said, "and kill every one of my people they can reach." I tried to take her hand and apologize, but she pulled away from me. "What is it with your people and nukes?" she half cried. "Why'd you have to do that?" She glared at me, silently demanding an answer. "We were scared," I said in a small voice. "Just like the first time. I think we were just scared of the alternative, of the bloodbath. People can do some god-awful things when they're frightened." She balled up her hands into fists. Then gestured to the distant hills where the Russians were camped. "Well, now you're gonna get your fucking bloodbath." I think that was the only time in our lives she ever looked at me with genuine hatred and contempt. Much later on, my wife told me that she was just venting her anger at the whole situation onto me, and I don't blame her in the slightest. She walked a little way down the riverbank, kicking stones furiously. Then she came back. She seemed to be gathering her resolve. Then, as she paced, the sounds of distant gunfire reached us. It was a dull, popping sound, like someone was setting off fireworks very far away. I stood up and turned my head, trying to hear what direction the noise was coming from. "They're coming," she said grimly. "You still want to fight with us?" I asked. "Yeah," she replied. "You know what, actually." Then she reached up to her shoulder and started tugging at one of the patches on her uniform. With some effort, she tore the rising sun flag off her shoulder and tossed it in the river. The insignia of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force slipped beneath the water and vanished. "When this is all over," she said, "I'm staying with you. Nakagawa pretty much said he wants me to die out here anyway, so fine. Princess Asami's dead, and so is Chiho Tatsuya." Then, with a great ripping sound, she tore the name tape off her uniform and threw it in the river too. The name Tatsuya faded away forever. I stood up and put a hand on her shoulder, which was shaking. "I'll be happy to go anywhere with you," I said. "I did say I'd be there for you, no matter what you called yourself or who you became, didn't I?" She gripped my hand tightly. "Actually, you promised." "Damn right I did. And I'll keep that promise, I swear." We were silent for a few moments, looking to the west, where the sounds of gunfire only seemed to be growing more intense. Finally, I built up the nerve to ask a question I'd been thinking over for a few days. "So, what do you want to call yourself anyway?" Almost reflexively, she stuck her hand in her pocket and produced 2 sets of metal ID tags. A Japanese name was stamped on each, and one of the 2 was caked in dried blood. "I was talking to Kotori about that," she said, her eyes welling up with tears. "Chihiro and Asuna were best friends. She said they were like sisters to her. And Newberry and Hernandez, they were nothing but kind to us, and none of them deserved to die like that. We decided, Tori and I, we wanted to..." She broke down crying again. I let her lean on my shoulder. "We wanted to preserve their names," she sobbed. "Keep some little bit of our friends alive, you know?" "I like that idea," I replied. She seemed encouraged and spoke a little more strongly. "Kotori said that she was so grateful to you and your friends from America for coming to find us. So, if she ever decides to have kids, the first boy will be named after Mateo, the first girl after Kate. Then, Tori asked me to take her friends' names, so their memories won't." She broke down again, and this time she was done talking. This was why she was carrying Asuna and Chihiro's dog tags ever since their burial. She'd been struggling with the act of taking their names for herself, even though she had the blessing of their one surviving friend. Hugging her tightly, I said the names of Kotori's friends aloud. Asuna Tachibana, Chihiro Iwasaki. Then the nameless former princess let go of me and grabbed a branch from a nearby tree. She began to write Japanese characters in the dirt. I had been immersed, partially or wholly, in Japanese culture for years by this point, and I could, with a lot of effort, read the writing on the ground. Asuna Chihiro. Then she stamped out the name with her foot and tried something else. Tachibana Iwasaki. "Been thinking about this for a while now," she muttered, stamping out this name too. Been trying lots of names. Asuna Iwasaki. This time, she only stamped out certain parts of the Japanese characters, using what remained to trace out a new name in the dirt. But no matter what I try, I always end up coming back to this one. It was a name consisting of 3 characters total. The first and third were incredibly detailed and complex. In fact, it looked like she had combined multiple characters to make compound symbols. The middle character was quite simple in comparison, needing only 3 strokes to complete. Chihiro Tachibana. "It's beautiful," was all I could say. "Thank you," she said. "This is me now."